All right, our next speaker is a well-known speaker in the speaking circuit. He's given, I think, thousands and thousands of discussions about technology and trends. The title of his presentation is Disruptive Innovation in Today's Energy Markets. Now, I'm going to attempt this name, and we practiced it several times, but I am from Valley View, Arkansas, and I can massacre a name pretty good. Colin, with your last name too, sir, I'll do my best. But it's his name is Patrick Schwerdtfeger, and I'll spell it for you. Schwerdtfeger. So I think I did pretty good on it, but I'm just going to call him Patrick is what I'm going to do. And one of the things I learned about Patrick yesterday, his flight was delayed out of Denver, but he did make it to a dinner only 30 minutes late. His flight landed and he hustled in, and he showed up in a coat and a tie, and a very nice looking. So let's make a good Arkansas welcome for Patrick.
Good morning. My last name's a bit of a disaster. It's 13 letters, only 3 vowels. So Schwerdtfeger. Actually, let's do it. You guys can do it together. Use the T in the middle as the anchor. So it's Schwerdtfeger. Come on. Schwerdtfeger. I should have run for governor. I live in California, which means I have a tricky job today. Especially after that last presentation. So at dinner, I actually had the opportunity to sit beside David, and I absolutely enjoyed the conversation we had. And everything he said, I agree with 100%. But I think there's a little bit of added context that I'm going to try and interject here. But again, I'm encouraging you all to see it as kind of an extension of his talk and maybe a little bit of added context. So my job, by the way, kind of what I have been doing for the last 17 years, I've spoken at events all over the world. And my job, so the marketing would say that I'm a business futurist, right? Which essentially means that I have to try and predict the future. And we all know that that's a fool's game. Not an easy thing to do. But there are some strategies that end up being useful when that's kind of your responsibility. And the easiest one, predictably, is to follow the money. And you can actually get some really good ideas of where things are going if you just follow where the money is going and where it's being invested in. And there's different sources, right? So you've got the private sector, which is the VC folks and the private equity folks. VC, for any of you who are interested, like maybe from an investment perspective or whatever, which is something I'm super passionate about, by the way, you don't want to look at the A rounds or the B rounds. It's once you get to the C rounds and the D rounds. Right? We're talking about people coming back 3 and 4 times to double down on their investment. Really interesting, because then you know the thing's got legs. But anyway, that's just one source. Of course, the government is the other, and they are spending more money than ever. We all know that, whether you agree with it or not. They're spending tons of money. And then the third one, which of course is an arm of the government as well, is military, but that really functions a little bit separately. So that's very interesting to do, but to look at what they're spending. And that's actually impacting, particularly in the nuclear space, the SMRs. I don't know how much of you guys follow the modular reactor space and the micros. That's a fascinating, of course, that all started because they had nuclear reactors on a submarine, right? So it had to be pretty small. And so the technology is growing out of that. There's a lot of promise there. I'm not going to touch on that too much in this conversation this morning because it is still nascent. The costs are still pretty high. But there is a lot of promise, a very exciting promise for the potential of modular small nuclear reactors, microreactors that could really make a huge dent in the future. But again, I'm not going to touch on that very much. But anyway, the goal is to kind of see the bigger picture. And you've all heard the phrase, which is very common, see the forest through the trees. Technically, it's see the forest for the trees. That was the original quote. But the bottom line is most of us, by necessity, just by the nature, particularly public companies where they've got quarterly earnings reports and so on, you kind of end up in the weeds. You kind of end up in the middle of the forest. And that's not a bad thing. That's what expertise is all about. Is really digging into the center of a field and trying to figure it out. And you got deadlines and you got milestones you're trying to hit and so on. And so you end up, and it creates what they call institutional blindness, where it's hard to see sometimes outside of what it is you're working on. So my job today really is to try, or do my best to try and give you that broader perspective of where we might be heading. Again, kind of 5 to 7 years in the future. And again, having said that, my disclaimer, which I say at every event that I do, you can't, predicting the future it's a fool's errand. It's very tricky to do. But having an idea of where these things might be heading can do a lot of good. And I'll say one more thing, by the way. So a business futurist, I mean, I basically focus on two things: technology trends and energy trends. So those are the two big areas. But I am not in the energy industry. You guys are. You guys are the experts in the field. And you're on the ground. You got the boots on the ground doing this day in, day out. So where this industry goes in the next 5 to 7 years are going to come from ideas that are going to come from all of you. They're never going to come from someone like me. But my job, hopefully, is to spur some ideas and get you thinking in a way that maybe you wouldn't have thought of otherwise. And that's my goal. That's what I'm going to do my best to do. And of course, today we're talking about the energy industry and the grid and so on. But if we're going to talk about the future of energy, we actually have to start with a conversation about technology. And so I'm going to spend kind of the first 20 minutes here giving you an idea of some trends, some things that are unfolding in the technology space, which are pretty remarkable. And in particular, I'm going to talk a little bit about machine learning, deep reinforcement learning. And of course, this is everywhere. It's on every news channel. And the biggest topic of the day is ChatGPT. I'm sure you're all familiar with ChatGPT. Pretty remarkable what this thing is doing. And of course, it was the most successful technological launch of all time. They managed to garner over 100 million active users in less than 2 months. No one's ever come close to that. So it really exploded onto the market. Now, by the way, that's kind of a very small subset of artificial intelligence. It's a large language model. It's essentially just trying to predict the next word, but it does it very, very well. But there's a whole other, there's a lot of other areas of artificial intelligence, and they're all happening really in the last 10 years. And why? Because of the IoT, because of big data, because we have more data than ever. And what's the number one thing that artificial needs to learn? It's data. It's a race for data. We're going to see that later in the presentation too. This is a mad dash. Everyone is trying to get as much data as they can. And the IoT is really fueling that. But anyway, another area where artificial intelligence is playing an increasing role is in energy optimization. Again, if you actually go back to the investing piece, for those of you who are active investors, and I'm definitely in that camp, some of the biggest opportunities going forward are companies that specialize in energy optimization, because as hard as it is to believe, up to 2/3 of the energy that we produce is lost and wasted somewhere along the way, whether it's transmission or wastage. I mean, it's incredible, all the different things. So there's a huge opportunity just in optimizing the energy that we actually produce. And that can go a long way. So there's some huge opportunities in energy optimization. One example of that is the large Tesla battery installation, which was installed in Australia a couple of years back. And you mentioned the other one, though it's in California, which is really fascinating. And what they're able to do now, so it's fascinating. This is maybe somewhat deceptive. So obviously it didn't reduce the cost of energy itself. But what it allowed them to do is to balance, like the fact that there was only 4 hours of capacity in the example that you gave, which is true. That's absolutely true, but what it allows you to do is it allows you to kind of modulate when the energy is coming in and when it's being deployed and what's the most optimal way of doing that, knowing what you expect the input of new energy to be in the next 2-3 hours or whatever. And there was dramatic impact on the cost of operating that grid in that particular area. There's a lot of promise there. So that's an area where technology is going to play a role. But it goes beyond that. You've got digital twin technology, which is really fascinating. You can map an entire drilling rig or fracking or anything, and of course an industrial plant in a digital setting, and you can do all the stress testing and different scenarios in a digital environment before you even break ground. It's really incredible, and we see this being used in all sorts of different areas where the digital twin technology is taking off. But the big one, and the one I want to focus on here right now, is with autonomous driving. And this is coming quicker than you might think. We're not quite there, but we're so close. I would, if I had to take a guess, and again, I've been wrong many, many, many times in my life, but if I had to take a guess, some form of level 5 autonomy, or at least level 4 autonomy, will be approved from a regulation standpoint next year, 2024. I'd be surprised if it didn't. But anyway, let's take a look at where that's going. So where's the most complicated place for an autonomous vehicle to have to navigate? Well, it would be a city center, right? It would be like, imagine like Manhattan in the middle of rush hour, in a snowstorm, I mean, something like that, right? That's going to be the most complicated area. And so who are the players in that space? Well, you've got Google Waymo, which has been, and I lived in the San Francisco Bay Area for 18 years. I live in Newport Beach, which is just a little bit south of Los Angeles. But anyway, these cars were on the road, literally 10 years ago, 12 years ago, and they still are. So fascinating what they're doing. Over that period of time, they've accumulated 300 million miles of data to work with. So who else is in the space? Well, you've got Tesla. And Tesla's got over 10 billion miles of data. So who's winning that race? Tesla. Right? It's a race for data. It's a race for data. And Tesla has a massive advantage because they have an enormous amount of data to work with. But Uber is trying to get into this space too. Now, they have a lot of data. It's different data than the other two, but it's still good data. And so they're trying to use that as their angle. And then in China, there's a whole bunch of players, including Didi, which is essentially an equivalent to Uber in China. There's some differences, but it's a similar model. And they're trying to get into the space. And there are others, but let's talk for a second about how these different platforms learn. And this is actually really interesting. This is an old story. This comes from I don't even know exactly, it might be 2016, but it's when Tesla first announced the first version of their autonomous driving, beta, their whatever it is, FSD. Anyway, there's a story of a guy who lived in Santa Cruz, which is just, over the hills from Silicon Valley. And on the way to his house, he had a Tesla. So the interesting thing is when Tesla announced this, the people who were buying Teslas had no idea that the cars they were buying were already outfitted with the technology for autonomous driving. Like the cameras and things were on there. They didn't even know. So when they made the announcement, there were already 70,000 vehicles on the road that could literally start testing it that same day. So, and this was one of the people who had one of those Teslas and was driving home. And apparently on the way to his home, there is a very sharp, kind of a hairpin corner. This isn't the corner. I just bought this image, okay? But you can imagine that there's a tight corner, okay? And the first time he was approaching that corner, he took his hands off the wheel. He's like, okay, let's see what you got. I'm not sure I would have done that. Anyway, the car didn't crash, but it veered outside of the lane. Then the brakes came on very heavily, and the light saying you have to take control of the vehicle came on. So it was essentially a fail. But the next day he did it again, and he did it again, and again, and again. And within 2 weeks, the car had learned how to take that corner. But it wasn't just his car that had learned to take that corner. It was every Tesla that had learned to take that corner. Does this make sense? This is very important, like for anyone who's curious to understand like why there's such intensity and passion associated with artificial intelligence. It's because of this. It's because they call it fleet learning, right? This is where the network effect, everyone in the network. So you have these unique situations of individual people on the network experiencing these unique situations, and it all goes up to the cloud. The cloud is an enabling technology. The whole thing wouldn't be possible without the cloud, right? So this goes up to the cloud, and they're able to solve the problems in the cloud and then deploy network-wide, right? That's why there's the opportunity is huge, and that's also it defines the exponential nature, the accelerating nature of it. The same thing's happening with ChatGPT and everything else. So anyway, so that gives you some idea. But what has less obstacles than New York City and rush hour and a snowstorm? Well, you've got the freeways. And so there's a huge market for what they call long-haul, hub-to-hub trucking. It's really fascinating, actually. So take a guess, if you will. What percentage of long-haul trucking rates go to the driver as a salary? Just throw it out if you have any ideas. Any ideas? 5% is 47%. 47%, which means that the first company that deploys autonomous trucks will have a 2-to-1 price advantage over everybody else. And what's that going to do? It's going to force every trucking company to adopt the same technology as fast as they possibly can. This is one of those examples where we know it's happening. We don't know exactly when, but sooner or later it's going to happen. And when it does, it's going to happen quick. It's going to happen quick. So who's in the space? Well, you've got Otto, which is a company purchased by Uber. They ran a bunch of tests, still are, of course. This was their first one, so it was autonomously. There was a guy in the truck, but he wasn't driving. Payload was 50,000 cans of Budweiser. Probably would be a different brand today. Anyway, it arrived on time. Okay. Who else is in the space? Well, USPS did a pretty big pilot program right before COVID and during COVID, primarily between Florida and Texas. And you've got these other concepts like this is the Mercedes autonomous truck. And of course, if you don't need a driver, you don't need a cab. So this is the Volvo iteration. It's pretty interesting. So this is another quick thing. But it's fascinating. So everyone assumes, so long-haul hub-to-hub trucking. So you got a hub outside of Little Rock, you got a hub outside of Dallas, and the trucking there potentially goes autonomous one day. But everyone thinks there's going to be like a crowd of, group of truck drivers at each of these hubs. And once the truck gets to that point, then one of the truck drivers is going to get in the truck and take it to the last mile. But that's not going to happen. I mean, it might happen somewhere, but it's not an efficient way to do it at all. The much more efficient way to do it, which has already started, is to set up like a business park outside of Boise, Idaho, that's filled with cubicles that have these sorts of simulators in them, and then they just patch into a truck and drive it last mile from that office complex. So it's no different than the fact that we're driving these drones out of Yemen, or God knows where, Sudan, and they're being driven out of Houston, Texas. So this is the latest Aston Martin simulator. And people think, they think that, these are being created for video games. I mean, that's true, but there's more to it. There's a giant market of autonomous trucks that are going to need to, or just vehicles in general that get in trouble somewhere. And so immediately it gets patched over to that business park, and someone who's on a simulator can patch in, all the cameras are there, and they can get that vehicle out of trouble. So that stuff's all coming. So it explains kind of, it is feasible that we end up with vehicles like this on the road. Anyway, what has fewer obstacles than the freeways? Well, you have agricultural land, right? And agricultural land, it's legal already, right? You've already got autonomous tractors. Especially in Iowa and stuff. It's ironic because California is not in the lead here because California, the plots of land are too small and they have too much diversity, whereas in Iowa, you've got like 1,000 acres that are dead flat. So you can map that territory to the square inch and run an autonomous tractor through the whole thing. It's incredible. So in other words, the place with the fewest obstacles, it's already legal. What's coming next? Probably the freeways. The long-haul hub-to-hub trucking. What's coming after that? The cities. So you kind of get an idea of where that's going to progress. This is the John Deere, the latest John Deere autonomous tractor. This stuff's it's already going on. And the same thing's true in the mining sector, where there's, again, that's, it's a defined space. And so it's already legal today where you can have these autonomous trucks. So this is coming, and it's coming quickly. We're really just waiting on the regulations, right? Now, here's where things get a little bit more interesting. And I wanted to go through this discussion because there's a convergence of two trends which is going to end up affecting the energy space. So, that second transition, of course, is from the gas-powered to electric, right? And again, there's some interesting things to consider here. So for the average, ICE vehicle, internal combustion engine, you've got roughly 2,000 moving parts, right? By contrast, the average electric vehicle has less than 100 moving parts. So that's interesting. That's a 95% reduction in moving parts, which affects the aftermarket service industry significantly. Now, there's still some challenge. There's a lot of challenges actually with electric vehicles. We're still in the early innings, but they're going to get this stuff figured out, and the aftermarket service sector is going to be vastly diminished using electric vehicles as compared to ICE vehicles. Now, what's the most expensive part in an electric vehicle? The battery. Yeah, of course. And the cost curve for batteries is well established now. It's been going on for a long time. Costs were coming down about 14% a year on average. Right now, it's less than that. It's about 12%. It changed for a little while because the price of lithium went up quite a bit, but now the price of lithium has come back down. So anyway, these things get, it's not quite as easy as a smooth curve, but you can get an idea. You can kind of project and say, okay, at what point is an electric vehicle going to literally be cheaper than an internal combustion engine? And the answer is actually right around now, 2023. And that's just the vehicle itself. There's a whole bunch of companies in China that are producing, I'm not saying they're good cars, but I am saying that the American manufacturers have not adequately prepared, in my opinion, for the competition that inevitably will come to our country from these Chinese companies. But anyway, this doesn't even take into account the fact that electricity is about 80% cheaper than gas on a per mile basis. Now, that also, of course, depends on the cost of electricity, which varies. So these are blanket statements, but put it this way, it's cheaper to fill up your Tesla with electricity than it is to fill up your BMW with gasoline. It's a lot cheaper to do it with a Tesla. So where's the lower overall cost of ownership? Well, it turns out that if you include service, if you include the fuel, if you include the vehicle itself, again, it depends on the brand, but you could argue that the lower overall cost of ownership actually happened a couple of years ago. So this transition to electric vehicles is coming, not because anyone is not even necessarily because of green energy versus non-green energy. I mean, that's obviously a motivating factor, certainly with the subsidies, but it's actually just the economics of it. Like the costs are coming down, whereas it's hard for the costs of internal combustion engines, hard for those costs to come down right now. It's kind of reached close to maximum efficiency, whereas in electric vehicles, there's still a lot of runway to reduce those costs over time. So we're going to see a lot, and of course, all the car companies have converged on this, and you see this kind of stuff all the time. One of the companies, the leading company in China is BYD. I don't even know how you say that, but this is their sedan here. But anyway, so you've got these converging trends, and this is a big part of what I end up spending a lot of my time on is to try and figure out what happens when these two trends kind of converge with each other. Where do we end up? And what's likely to come is transport as a service. I'm sure you guys have heard that all before, where you could have an Uber, but it's an electric autonomous vehicle that picks you up and takes you somewhere. And the interesting thing about it, so all of you have a car, but where is that car right now? For many of you, it's parked somewhere, right? And that's the privately owned vehicles is actually one of the lowest utilization rate purchases in terms of a significant purchase, durable good purchase, if you will, that people make. Like the car sits there 90% of the time not being used. It's only being used for small periods of time. By contrast, the transport as a service vehicle can literally be driving the entire time or as much as possible, depending on demand. Rush hours is going to be higher, and during the middle of the night, they won't need to be driving as much, but they can certainly be driven a lot more. So the utilization rate is higher, which drives the usage cost way down. So Elon Musk recently made a speech where he estimated that the cost of their Tesla robo-taxis he anticipates is going to be at 18 cents a mile. Now, the average cost per mile today for Uber and Lyft, and we all know that it varies dramatically, right? By usage, urban, rural, there's a huge variance, but the average across the country is about $2 a mile. So we're talking about a 90% reduction on a per mile basis once this transport as a service actually hits the market. Which could be relatively soon. There's a lot of other experts that are anticipating it could be as little as 10 cents a mile. If that happens, we're talking about a 95% reduction in the cost of transport. So you could actually feasibly anticipate that companies would end up providing transportation for free in exchange for a captive audience of the people in their bus. Right? You could anticipate that this is, if you look at the P&L of Starbucks currently, it's all available, of course, and look at the percentage of every dollar that they spend on marketing, it would actually be cheaper and very much viable for them to offer transportation for free if we got to 10 to 18 cents per mile. If that's true, they could provide transportation for free in exchange for a captive audience. And you could have all sorts of different companies providing free transportation in exchange for, I know it sounds crazy, but feasibly, using today's model of the P&L, these things could be possible. And we're not talking about individuals buying one vehicle. We're talking about large companies taking Wall Street money and buying 100,000 vehicles in one order. Amazon is one example. Just before COVID, placed an order for 100,000 electric delivery vehicles. So you start to get an idea. We're right on the cusp of some of these sorts of things that could be coming, and there truly is this exponential effect. So, and here's just to give you an idea. A lot of these concepts have come out of vehicles that are being proposed by, that's a Kia, by the way. This is a Bosch. I mean, it's just fascinating, some of the different vehicles that are coming out and what is potentially coming our way. But the adoption of electric vehicles is happening. It's actually happening the slowest, not the slowest, but the USA is quite slow in our adoption. Who's leading the charge? Any guesses? It's pretty obvious. Europe is definitely leading the charge, and China is in the mix as well. This is actually, you can tell by the commas here, this is a European slide. And then, of course, we've got electrification coming to potentially the trucking industry as well. So this is all, we're going to see a lot of these charging stations. And that represents, so these charging stations are expected to scale. A huge number of charging stations are expected to be built in the coming years. And this puts a huge amount of pressure on the grid. Now, the infrastructure bill, I mean, the kind of bills that they're passing in Washington are insane in many ways. But the bottom line is they passed this thing, and it does include $65 billion to improve the grid. I'm not convinced it's even enough. And the problem, as you all know, is mainly transformers, which really, I mean, so the more decentralized the energy network becomes, the more transformers you need. And so a lot of the plants, including ERNCO, is doing a remarkable job of increasing production. It's actually incredible what they're doing. 15%, I think, this year, with another 18% projected next year. It's really fascinating. I mean, they're a leader in this space, but there are others. But it ends up becoming a conversation mostly about refurbishment at this point, like to refurbish transformers that have been out for a long time, because it takes time to scale up that production. But anyway, so the bottom line is there's investments coming, and they've already begun, of course, on the grid, which is going to help. But we've got this global energy demand, which is absolutely surging, and will continue to surge. The demand for energy. So where do the political elites want all of that energy to come from? They want it to come from solar, right? And they want it to come from wind. And we all know the downsides of each of those. But it's worth talking about, because it's pretty interesting. Now, this is a chart that talks about cost per kilowatt hour if you're starting from scratch. So in other words, the hydroelectric dam doesn't exist yet. You have to build it and amortize the cost, and these sorts of things. But it is interesting. What is the cheapest form of energy if you start with nothing right now? It's actually solar. In terms of just like, the least cost to get a kilowatt hour, if you're starting from scratch, is actually solar. And wind is next, and then natural gas on top of that. So in particular, the cost of solar panels is it's unreal how much. So this is a logarithmic scale here. So it's deceptive. I mean, it's impressive as it is, but it's way more impressive if you actually do this on a linear scale. Like, the cost of PV panels just continues to come down and down and down. Now, the problem is they're all manufactured in China, so we're basically handcuffing ourselves to buying a product from China on a huge scale. So, and I fully understand the implications there. But it is remarkable how the cost of solar, there's two components. Number one, how cheaply can they make the PV panels? But number two, how efficient are those panels? And the efficiency is going up as well. So between the two, it's absolutely remarkable what is possible with solar. So, when you look at the overall chart. So not surprisingly, we've seen solar all over the place and huge installations happening really all over the place, and many of them are floating in water, which is interesting. Here is this is the biggest solar installation in the world. Any guesses on which country, where it's located? It's not China. That would have been my guess, but it's not China. Not Australia, it's India, believe it or not. So again, so for example, Chile in South America, they had a large hydroelectric project. They were going to put a big dam in place, and it was very political. There was a lot of controversy about it. $5 billion project. They ended up abandoning the project altogether and doing a solar farm instead because it was actually cheaper to get the energy using that. And this is assuming, you talk about where are we going to be 5 to 7 years, right? That's my job, is to try and ask that question over and over. The price of solar is very, very low today, especially on an industrial scale, on a utility scale. It's very, very low. But it's continuing to drop. Like the cost of solar panels is down 90% in the last 5 years, much less the past 30 years, and it's going to continue to drop. So just from an economic standpoint, we can expect lots of, and of course there's tons of subsidies for it, not just here, but around the world. So it's going to continue to scale. It will. I'm not saying it's going to solve all our problems. We'll get to that. But I'm just saying it is here, and it's going to continue to grow at an accelerated rate. So these are projections, and wind has done actually better in the recent time, but solar is now picking up the pace. And here's a graph that just kind of talks about the distribution of the energy sector here in the United States. And even here, like these are small percentages, but 12 to 14%, that's a pretty big jump. And 14 to 16%, that's a pretty big jump. So if you actually project it forward, and we don't know, we have no guarantee that the current growth rate is going to continue. We have no guarantee. I have no guarantee. But if it did, and we also, I know that we're never going to have 100% solar, it's not possible. The base load is a huge issue. There's lots of things you just can't do with electricity. When it comes to, David talked about like bending metal and forging steel and so on. Like you're going to need fossil fuels. It's never going to go away. And I'm not suggesting here, don't misunderstand what I put here, that this is what I think is going to happen. But what I'm saying is that the current trend is growth. And every year, if it continues to grow at 15% of the overall pie here in the United States every year, this actually becomes pretty significant pretty quickly. And again, I'm not suggesting we're going to get to these percentages. I'm just running the math. And I was like, if it continued at this pace, how long would it take? Turns out it's actually not long at all before we end up in a situation. Now, what do you need in order for solar or wind to be viable, right? The sun isn't shining 24 hours a day, so you need batteries, right? So, and this is that solar. This is the battery installation in Australia here. And sure enough, so the battery production is scaling as well. By the way, the cost graph that I put up there just a second ago showing that solar is the cheapest does not include the cost of batteries, of energy storage. So as soon as you include that in the mix, then it makes the solar more expensive, okay? So there's a lot of things, like there's so many nuances to this, like you have to figure out exactly what's included depending on what number you use. So there's a lot of people, frankly, who are on one side of the political spectrum or the other, and they're using numbers that are convenient for them without acknowledging the other side of it. So, and I want to be careful. I want to make the argument. It's important that I make the argument, but I also want to say that the cost of batteries is a huge piece. Now, the cost of batteries is coming down significantly, and there's a lot of new technologies, for example, that don't require lithium. And that's a huge thing because there's a lot of problems with lithium-ion batteries. There's actually just recently Toyota announced a breakthrough solid-state battery. Turns out they're having some problems with it, but it has like a way higher energy density and it's quicker charge times and all sorts of things. So we can expect innovations to continue as investment continues. But batteries are scaling, and not just on the industrial scale, but also on the consumer side. So if you look at the whole balance of power, right? The bottom line is we've got a situation where solar is scaling and wind is scaling, but at a slightly slower rate. And it could make up a significant piece of the pie in 15 years, but it isn't there yet. So what's going to pick up the slack? And we've already talked about it today, and you guys all know, of course, but it's natural gas. And this is a conversation, this is a topic that I believe it's all political. This whole thing is political. And I think there's going to be a storyline that's going to emerge in the next 12 months as the election picks up, which is going to catch a lot of people off guard. Because I'm not just talking about natural gas as it is, but I'm talking about liquefied natural gas and what's happening in that space. So let me tell you a little bit about what's happening there. Because as I said, natural gas is very, very inexpensive. I mean, it is extremely affordable. And the slides that David used, and I loved his presentation, was referring to fossil fuels and including natural gas in that line. And it is a fossil fuel, so that's the correct thing to do. But we should acknowledge that natural gas is much cleaner than oil, coal, so on, traditional gasoline. So natural gas is cleaner than that, and in fact, Europe has even gone so far as to declare that natural gas is a green energy source only because they had no choice, right? They had no choice, so we all know that. But the bottom line is, natural gas is not perfect, but it's a pretty good option. And you can do base load, and we've figured out ways to transport it. Obviously, the pipelines work great, but the liquefied natural gas is a huge piece. So natural gas is a viable option, and just to show you, this is literally the stock chart of natural gas. So this is when the war in Ukraine started, but the price of natural gas is at the bottom of the barrel. It is cheap. The prices are low. Why is that? Because there's lots of it. There's more and more all the time. So now, I also know that there's some restrictions from a regulatory standpoint to block things like natural gas in people's homes, which is driving people crazy. I have a gas stove and I love it. But there's some intuitive logic to what's going on because they don't want to build an infrastructure reliance. Like you've got infrastructure in the form of homes that are reliant on natural gas, knowing that perhaps in 20, 25, 30 years, natural gas will be playing a smaller piece at that time. And so I understand why they're doing it. I don't like it, but I understand why they're doing it. But the bottom line is they're doing everything to promote the liquefied natural gas export capacity, even the Biden administration is, which is stunning, against the wishes of their progressive arm. So we've had, this slide is now a couple years old, but at that time we had 6 natural gas export, LNG, liquefied natural gas export terminals, and they were all basically in the Gulf of Mexico, which services the Atlantic, so primarily the European market. But at that time, there were 16 that were either in construction or approved and soon to be in construction, and now 2 of those have gone through the construction process and they're online, and there's 14 left, but now there's even more proposals. So it's absolutely insane. Our export capacity for LNG is exploding, and the U.S. is crushing it in LNG. This is something that the Democrats aren't saying a word of. And I believe it's because they want to lead the Republicans into a trap. Because they're saying so much about oil and coal and gas. And I think in the next 12 months, they're going to start talking about this. We'll see. I might be wrong. But it's pretty remarkable. The exports that we've had in natural gas, liquefied natural gas, have just been exploding. And this is at a time when our oil production in this country are literally at all-time highs in history. The most oil we've ever produced. It's like, I think it's 17.7 million barrels. It's incredible per day. So we're by far the largest oil producer in the world. We're not the biggest oil exporter because we use a lot of our own oil, but the production rate is massive. And there's implications there too. And what do we have going on at the same time? Well, we've got the Ukraine war. And I believe that there are people in positions of power who want this war to go on as long as humanly possible because it ties Russia's hands. They're broke and they're busy, and they can't produce LNG export capacity. They don't have the resources to do it, which allows us to turbocharge our own LNG export capacity and put ourselves in a dominant position for the coming 15 years. And the truth is that that's exactly what's been happening. And then on top of that, as icing on the cake, you've got the Nord Stream 2 pipeline being destroyed. I'm not going to talk about who might have done that, but I'll tell you that the US LNG export industry is not upset about it. They're not upset about it. So who knows how it happened, but it ends up becoming a political discussion. And look, I'm not a fan of Biden. I'm not, and maybe some people are. That's totally fine. Me personally, I'm not a fan. But he knows what he might personally not know, but his team, no. Whatever, guys. I'm not. I grew up in Canada. Okay, like I'm generally. I have many liberal instincts, but anyway, they know what they're doing. Like the Republicans, I worry that the Republicans are being led into a trap. That's what I think. Because during this administration, the LNG export capacity in this country has exploded. And it's and he is signing everything on the first day he can, with zero delay. Zero delay. I've got examples in a second, but the bottom line is this war does not hurt our LNG export capacity industry. They might be putting restrictions on domestic natural gas usage. I know that that's happening. I know there's issues here. But anyway, we're exporting. I mean, this whole thing is exploding, and our exports to Europe as a result of the war have absolutely exploded. And so Biden just recently approved the Willow Project up in Alaska. Again, the first day he could, he approved it. The progressive arm of the Democrats was dead against it. He didn't hesitate for a second. He signed it because we're building export terminals up in Alaska, right? They call it the North Slope. And that whole thing is all about LNG. And then a month later, he approved a pipeline. Again, the progressive wing was dead against it. He signed it the first day he could because that gets the LNG from the North Slope down to where those export terminals are. Because who are the biggest LNG importers in the world? Oh, did I go too far? Right there. Japan, South Korea, and China are the largest importers of LNG in the world. So it's pretty interesting. And if you have capacity in Alaska, that serves the Pacific Ocean, which allows us to go to the east, whereas all the existing capacity that we have is in the Gulf of Mexico, and it goes to Europe to the other side. So it's pretty interesting what's happening. It also explains what's happening with Saudi Arabia, i.e., nothing, because Saudi Arabia doesn't have any LNG export capacity whatsoever. So their relevance in the future energy market is diminishing, right? Oil is still very important, but LNG is playing an increasing role year after year, and they don't have access to it. So right now, this is a few years old. So right now, because those two new terminals have opened up, the U.S. is now the #1 LNG export capacity country in the world, and it's by a significant margin. Australia is 2, and Qatar is #3. The whole industry has turned on its head, and the U.S. is dominating the space. So a year ago, roughly, the Chinese leader, Xi Jinping, visited Saudi Arabia. They gave him a hero's welcome, and the U.S. media portrayed it as this giant foreign policy mistake that Biden had made because he, of course, did not get any such welcome. But the bottom line is we know exactly what the future looks like, and it involves LNG, and we're already dominating in that space. So there's a lot to be said for where this stuff is going to come from in the years to come, and natural gas is going to play a huge role, including LNG. And we all know that natural gas can be a problem when temperatures get really cold. And now that we've figured out LNG storage capacity from the boats, right? I think this was even the case in New York. We're going to have LNG storage capacity probably throughout this country in the near future, which of course doesn't mind cold temperatures at all. because they need it pretty cold. So if you want to look at kind of the broader view of what's happening and my perspective on that, like I completely agree with what David is saying. Fossil fuels are here to stay for a long time, but there's certain sectors of the economy that require fossil fuels, which includes natural gas. But natural gas in particular is going to soon displace the others. We all know that coal plants, if you're going to do anything with them when you shut them down, the easiest thing you can do is switch them over to natural gas because the hardware is mostly the same. It's just a different heating source. So there's a chance that some of these coal plants that are being shut down could be transitioned to natural gas in the future. That's a possibility. And we're going to see this energy. We haven't even talked about Bitcoin. The price of Bitcoin is going up, which means what? People are going to mine more Bitcoin. And the mining operations for Bitcoin take just an absolutely insane amount of energy. And I know a lot of that is coming to Arkansas. I know you guys have demand here in this state for that. So the energy management is going to continue to increase. Technology will play a role. The software, artificial intelligence, energy optimization will play a role for sure. So will energy storage. There's a lot of energy storage innovations that are coming. We're going to see more of that as time goes on, which will tap into the solar and wind resources, which are intermittent, of course. And this chart of what the cheapest sources are is unlikely to change. So we'll see how far it goes. I'm not suggesting it's going to go to 100%. I'm not saying that. But the current trend is that it's taking a larger piece of the pie every year that goes by. And certainly the export capacity is a big part. The U.S. is in pole position when it comes to LNG exports for the foreseeable future, let's say next 10, 15 years. So I'm gonna stop there. But I'm pretty much right on time. So I don't even know if do I have time for questions? I don't know. Do we? I love questions. So, and I'm sure there's some of you who probably disagree with something I've said. So, any questions? Fire away. Oh, come on.
I've got a question.
Yes, please.
Is that, the screen back there, can I flip back a slide? Is that you?
Yeah, I gotta change it out. You know, the TED thing, people like TED, so I did it back in 2013. So I still use it. I have a beard now. It's all white. I used to color my beard, but my girlfriend told me to stop, so.
I used to have hair.
Yeah. You know, I don't mind.
Oh, I really did.
I've got salt and pepper up here, it's fine, but here, it's right here. I look like a skunk. It's like this straight line of white.
Yeah. Okay.
Anyway, there was a question over here. Well, I mean, this is commentary that I have no place getting into. I did it here because I like this audience. Believe it or not, I live in California, but I identify much more with the Republican side, especially the last 5. Anyway, I think this LNG narrative, I think they're keeping it quiet and letting the Republicans go on and on about how Biden has destroyed the domestic energy market. He's destroyed the oil. He's limiting everything. EPA, it's criminal. They're destroying our economy. And the Republicans have been droning on about that for years already. And meanwhile, there's a different narrative, which is that we have plenty of energy. We have more than ever before. We're exporting like crazy. And I just think that they're waiting until the campaign is in full swing and we understand who the Republican candidate is going to be. And by the way, I would be shocked if Biden is on the ticket. I fully expect him to, at some point, they're going to capture all the headlines and have a big transition. And next thing you know, you're going to have someone else like Gavin Newsom. I have no idea, but I mean, the guy is old, you know, and everyone knows it, even the Democrats do. So. But anyway, I think they're setting a trap, and I think they're going to come out in the campaign and put up all these graphs and be like, we have the highest oil production ever in U.S. history right now under the Biden administration. We have the highest LNG capacity of any country in the entire world. Look at these export chart. I think they're going to, that's what I would expect. If I was in the Democratic Party, which I'm not, that's what I would do. I would keep it quiet until 6 months before the election, and then I would plaster it everywhere. So we'll see. I might be wrong, and I have no problem being, I'm wrong all the time. But that's what I would do.
Patrick,
So-
thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Did that work?
Yeah, that's great.
Good
Thank
job.
you. And you
Thank
got my
you.
name good, too.
Thank you, Patrick.